the world of Zoom and technology and connectedness. So thank you so much for all of your patience for this. Welcome to Tuesday Times Roundtable. Thank you all for attending today, either virtually or in person. Each week we engage in conversation about current global trends, problems, and opportunities that are interest to you, FIU students and faculty and friends. So our weekly Tuesday Times Roundtable is made possible. Let's see if I can get my slide clicker to work. There we go. There we go. It's made possible through a formal partnership with New York Times. And this partnership also brings a New York Times guest speaker to FIU once a year, annually, to provide FIU students, faculty, and staff with a guest speaker. And you also get free digital access to the New York Times. And the link is up on the slide in case you're interested in that. I am Anna Prado. I'm a graduate assistant in the Office of Global Learning Initiative. You may have already noticed that I am not your usual presenter, so bear with me. It is my pleasure to present Michelle Ortiz today. So with me are my colleagues, Sherry Beeson, who is buzzing around busy, your regular TTR host and our senior program coordinator at the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, and Michelle Zaldivar, the program coordinator with Zoom. So those of you who are joining via Zoom, please give Michelle a little extra thanks. We want to welcome you. What? Okay. So whether you're joining us here face-to-face or live via Zoom, we're glad you're here. If you're joining us as a Global Learning Medallion student, please remember that you earn 1 point for attending today's session. If you'd like to learn more about Global Learning Medallion or other programs for students, stick around after the presentation and speak to Michelle Z, Sherry, or myself, and we'll steer you in the right direction. Later during our session, we'll be taking questions. If you're joining us virtually, post your questions in the chat, and Michelle will share your questions. Otherwise, Sherry and I will come around with microphones as we do every week to make sure that our speaker hears your questions. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest. It's not my pleasure to introduce today's guest. It is, but not right now, because first we're going to talk about GlobeMed. So this is another one of our student-facing clubs. Those of you who are interested in global justice and healthcare, many people were interested last week, so I wanted to post it up again this week. If you're interested in GlobeMed, there's a QR code that you can take a picture of and use. Right now, we're in the middle of a rebuilding year, trying to rebuild the organization itself with student membership. So if you're interested, you can see us after the presentation or use that handy dandy QR code. It's going to eventually work. Okay. I'm missing a slide. Okay. Are you, okay. So Michelle Ortiz is the Deputy Director of Americans for Immigrant Justice, which is AIJ. She has over 14 years of experience providing the legal services to low-income immigrants with a specialization in assisting survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking. As AIJ's Deputy Director, she oversees the agency's direct representation service and engages in policy advocacy, which is exactly why she's here today. So without much further ado, please welcome Michelle Ortiz from AIJ. How about now? What? It's the cord back here. Sorry. Can you hear me? Hello? Check. 1, 2, 3. I think it's not. How about now? No? Oh. Do I leave it? Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me today. This is my first in-person work-related event since COVID started. So I'm super excited to be here. So as Anna
Immigrant, I'm the Deputy Director at Immigrants for Immigrant Justice. We are a nonprofit law firm, okay? We provide free legal services to immigrants of all nationalities and quite a range of statuses throughout South Florida. And we also engage in significant policy advocacy work related to immigrant rights, both locally at the state level and nationally. I think I skipped the slide. Sorry. Sure. So I'll tell you a little bit about the history of our organization. Our organization was founded in 1996, and it was founded in response to some pretty serious anti-immigrant legislation that passed. There were a whole series of anti-immigrant bills that passed under the Bill Clinton administration in 1996. And one of those pieces of legislation stated that federally funded legal aid organizations were not permitted to assist undocumented immigrants. So all of a sudden, from one day to the next, traditional legal aid organizations, excuse me, that were part of the Legal Services Corporation, so federally funded, were prohibited, excuse me, prohibited from helping undocumented immigrants or immigrants who are not already lawful permanent residents. So even immigrants who may have had some kind of legal status but were not residents. On day one, a team of 10 former legal service organization attorneys inherited 3,000 cases from a whole bunch of legal aid down here in South Florida. That's how we were founded. And I think that the fact that we were founded because of a change in law that was extremely harmful made sure that the mission of our organization from the very beginning, from its very founding, included not just representing or defending individual immigrants, but working to change these racist and anti-immigrant policies. Next slide. Next slide. So AI Justice, we don't charge anyone for our services, and we've developed really specialized different legal programs to serve the most vulnerable in our community and those who are least likely to find immigration representation. We have different programs that represent different vulnerable populations. So the first program is the LUCHA program. The LUCHA program represents immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. The LUCHA program was actually born out of one very large case in Southwest Florida, where dozens of women were being held as essentially sex slaves for the men who labored in the fields of Southwest Florida. That program was born out of that, and that was before there was a word, the phrase human trafficking. So they used to call it white slavery, they used to call it other forms of slavery, but they didn't call it human trafficking, and there was no national anti-trafficking law. That program was founded in 1997, and in part of establishing that program, we recognized that there were not federal protections for immigrant survivors of human trafficking. And so we used the stories of our clients to engage in advocacy at the federal level to ensure that immigrant survivors of human trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, would be protected and would have a right to defend themselves from deportation and a path to legal status. Our detention program was founded at the very beginning. One of our founders had done a lot of work related to detention. I'll talk about that more specifically later. But our detention program provides free legal services to adults who are detained by ICE in South Florida's detention center. We have 3 in South Florida. We have the Chrome Processing Center, which is a nice way of saying the Chrome Immigration Jail, here in Miami-Dade County. We have the Broward Transitional Center, which is another immigration detention center in Broward, and the Glades County Jail, which has a contract with ICE to hold undocumented immigrants for their deportation proceedings. Our family defense program was born out of anticipated policy changes. So as soon as President Trump was elected, we knew and anticipated that there was going to be a huge change in immigration policy. And we decided that we needed to be able to respond to the community in a different way. So we created the Family Defense Program, which has kind of 2 main goals. One is to provide a lot of community and outreach all over the state of Florida to ensure that immigrants understand what their rights are, understand differences in policy, changes in policy. Things move really quickly in immigration when it comes to kind of from one presidential administration to another. And it also provides free deportation defense to individuals who have close ties to the United States, have family members who were born here or have green cards, really with the focus of keeping families together. Our children's legal program was born, I think, in 1998, when one of our attorneys was at immigration court, and an INS officer, so they didn't have ICE yet, an INS officer came into immigration court carrying a baby. And the judge said, "Who is this baby with?" The baby was on her own, baby Margaret. And one of our attorneys stood up and said, "I'll defend her. She's in deportation proceedings with a government prosecutor present and no one to fight for her." And that attorney kind of went on this investigative mission to figure out who are these children, why are they being detained, why are they alone? And our children's legal program was born. We represent every detained child in South Florida. There are currently 4 facilities where unaccompanied children are held in South Florida. And you may have heard of the Homestead Detention Center that got a lot of press, which closed in 2019. We're the attorneys that provide the services to every detained child in South Florida, including every child that was at the Homestead Detention Center. Finally, our litigation program is one of the tools that we use to engage in systemic change. So our litigation program takes a lot of the information that we learn through our direct representation and tries to affect systemic change through federal litigation. So essentially by suing the government to improve conditions. So we have had lawsuits to improve detention conditions. We have had lawsuits fighting the cruelty at the border, which has been going on for decades. And our most recent litigation Can you hear me better? Our most recent litigation is on behalf of separated families. So as I'm sure many of you heard, the Trump administration separated thousands of families at the border illegally. And we represented 125 of these children when they were detained in South Florida, and were able to reunite 100 of them. But we have filed a federal lawsuit in partnership with other organizations who also represent separated families, essentially suing the federal government for the damage that they caused to these families demanding that they provide mental health services. First of all, demanding that they reunite all the families who are still unreunited. Over 1,000 kids are still not reunited with their parents. So we're fighting that they be reunited. We're fighting for mental health services. We're fighting for damages, monetary relief, and ultimately we're fighting for them to be protected from deportation. Next slide. So why is fixing the immigration system such a struggle? I really struggled with this slide. I didn't even know where to begin. And I think it's for those who are not very familiar with immigration law, I think it's a little incomprehensible how complicated the system is, okay? So you have a whole series of statutes that address all these different people and all these different ways of either being eligible for legal status or being what's called inadmissible or deportable, like what bars you from being able to get a green card, what makes you eligible for deportation. None of it makes any sense. None of it is tied to common sense. None of it is easy to understand. I've been practicing immigration law for 14 years. Prior to that, I interned somewhere and all I did was immigration law for 3 years. And I learn new stuff every day, right? Some random subsection of a statute. The regulations are also a mess. There are a lot of lawsuits around regulations. So you may have a regulation that the Trump administration flew past and got it published, not through the proper means. And then there's a lawsuit about that. And one day the judge pauses the regulations, and then 8 days later, the regulations are back in effect. So you're constantly battling all of these changes. And then there are these sometimes really obscure policy memoranda that tell the governmental agencies how to interpret the federal statutes and the federal regulations. And sometimes those memoranda are really hard to find. At our office, we have a whole section in our cloud of all these secret memos, right, of how they interpret different regulations and statutes. And if we didn't track them and keep them all, our staff would never find them, right? You can't find them doing your traditional methods of legal research. As I'm sure many of you know, immigrants and immigration policy have often been the result of there's been a major crisis in the United States, and instead of pointing the finger at policymakers and those who are really culpable, we almost always just go straight to pointing the finger at immigrants, okay? The 1996 laws that were so harmful to immigrants, including the one regarding funding, they were a direct response to the Oklahoma City bombing, which had absolutely nothing to do with immigrants, okay? Domestic terrorist, nothing to do with immigrants. People were afraid, people were outraged, and what did Congress decide to do? Let's make our country more secure by making immigration almost impossible for the vast majority of people. So in 1996, a whole series of bills were passed that made it really, really difficult for people to legalize their status. So one of the things it did was it said, for example, if you entered without authorization, so if you cross the border, nobody sees you, and then you otherwise become eligible for a green card, you marry an American citizen, or an employer, you have this extreme talent, and this employer wants to sponsor you. Well, too bad, you entered illegally. There's no way around it. There's no waiver. There's no way you will ever legalize your status in the United States. It did a whole host of things. We could spend a whole semester talking about how harmful this law is. But what's really important to understand is that the estimated 11 million undocumented people in the United States are undocumented because of this law, right? Vast majority of them have family members who could petition for them, have an employer who could petition for them, but they are automatically disqualified by this anti-immigrant law that does not provide a waiver for that. There's no like asking for forgiveness, prove you've been paid your taxes, prove you've been here for X amount of years, never been arrested, like no discretion. It also has a whole list of crimes that make you ineligible or that make you deportable even if you have a green card. And a lot of these are called aggravated felony. Even though by definition in this federal statute, it includes a lot of nonviolent misdemeanor crimes, but they're still categorized as aggravated felonies in federal immigration law. So you have this 1996 series of laws that are super complicated, that make it really difficult for people to legalize their status. Then you have all of this kind of exacerbated by 9/11, right? After 9/11, we saw a direct response to that was, again, target immigrants, detain immigrants, expand immigration detention. And every time we've had an economic crisis, even under COVID, right? They shut down the border, or all these people are claiming that it's immigrants that are bringing COVID to the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a very common response, and a system in which the vast majority of people who are affected cannot vote to change the system, right? Next slide. So you probably can't read it from here. But if you Google what part of legal immigration you don't you understand, it's a really superficial but really good understanding of all the hoops that people have to go through in order to regularize their status and what excludes people from being able to legalize their status. It doesn't include every pathway. It doesn't include every way that people get shut out, but it shows that the vast majority of people simply don't have a path. Okay, you can go next. Okay. So in doing this work, one of our really core missions or philosophies is that, sure, we can help people one by one. We can reunite families one by one, help people get their green cards, help people apply for temporary protective status, defend people from deportation one by one, get people out of detention one by one. But we're gonna be doing this forever. And our goal is that our job not be needed anymore, right? That's when we know that we've succeeded. When I have to find a different area of law to practice, right? Where immigrants are treated with dignity, where immigrants are not detained, when immigrants are not subject to deportation. And so, you know, what kind of an impact do we have one by one? For those families that we represent, the impact's immeasurable, right? But this cycle of over and over and over again, no matter how brilliant our attorneys are, no matter how long we're willing to fight for them, these things are not going to change unless we try to affect change. And so how do we do that? So as a nonprofit law firm, our methods of affecting change are really different, I think, than a lot of grassroots organizations, than other activist organizations. So we have to recognize what our role is. What are our skills and how can we help the movement and how can we change systems? And so the way that we have done this is by ensuring that our clients are at the center of all of our efforts to affect systemic change. So our direct legal services learn, for example, I'll go to family separation because I think it's something that most people are aware of. We started hearing from kids that they were separated from their parents almost a year and a half before it went public, before the crisis started, right? And it started with a 3-year-old little girl, and we had no idea where she came from. And we had no idea how to identify her, and she was detained. A 3-year-old can't tell you what her mom's name is, what her dad's name is, what city she was born in. All she could do was put up 3 little fingers and tell us she was 3 years old. So we started trying to figure out, how did this happen to this girl? How can we try to figure out who her family is? And then I think it was about 6 weeks later, we met an 8-year-old boy who was detained. He could tell us his father's first name. He could tell us that the last time he saw his dad was in a facility with some guards who told him they were going to take him to have a bath, and he never saw his dad again. So we started seeing these patterns and hearing more and more stories from the kids that we serve at the detention center. And of course, our first instinct was, what is going on? Why is this happening? And what can we do about it? And we tried to get media attention around it. They weren't interested, right? The questions were, well, you don't know, dad might be an axe murderer. You don't know what happened at the border. And it was true, we had no idea. We had no idea what was happening. And then we started seeing more and more children, dozens and dozens of children who had been separated from their parents. And older kids that were 12, 15, 16, who could tell us exactly what happened, exactly what their parents' full names were, their date of birth. And we were able to find parents in adult detention centers spread out across the country. And so this is where we decided, okay, well, how long can this go on for? Representing one kid at a time, reuniting one kid at a time, trying to get the parent out of adult detention, get the kid out of the ORR facility, which is where they're detained, and reunite them. Great, but this needs to stop. And so we partnered with other organizations across the country who also serve detained children in trying to elevate this issue and make it as loud and as public as we possibly could, call every media outlet, and do it together, right, across the country. So it's not just the Miami Herald, it's the New York Times, it's the Washington Post, it's the West Coast, and really fight to elevate this issue. And that was also a lesson in, under the Trump administration, we couldn't do a lot of the types of advocacy that we're used to doing, and I'll talk about a little bit about that later. So there was no talking to the White House, there was no talking to ICE, there was no typical advocacy that we could do, try to get a law passed to stop this immediately. So the only advocacy that we could engage in was a massive public media pressure campaign. And it worked, right? People were outraged, and it was the only way to get it to be reversed. So that's a good example of how we meet these individual clients and decide this is a systemic issue and we need to make change. And so typically, we strategize on how are we going to stop this horrible thing, usually, be it adult detention conditions, family separation, administrative issues. So a lot of times what we see is maybe the policy is really good, right? There's a new policy and it's really good. We're super excited. We had a party, we were just celebrating. And the actual governmental agency in charge of implementing that policy doesn't want to, right? So we've seen that a lot with ICE, for example. So there could be a directive straight from headquarters that ICE can only detain A, B, and C type of person. We go to the detention center and it's full of everybody except A, B, and C, right? So engaging in that administrative advocacy with the governmental agencies to ensure that they're implementing the policies correctly. And if they don't, that's when we strategize about federal litigation to force them to comply with the law or with the policy. Next slide. A lot of the ways that we've engaged in advocacy as well, particularly when maybe the media is not that responsive to the issue, is we've written a lot of reports. So if you go to our website, I think all of our reports are on there. And we started writing the reports right when we were founded in 1996. I think the first report was either about detention conditions or about Haitian asylum seekers at Guantanamo. And so the purpose of these reports is to collect all the data that we have regarding the situation, and more than anything, center and uplift the voices of those who are affected, right? Center and uplift the voices of our clients, the communities that have been harmed, and ensure that their voices, their perspective, and their experiences are at the center of the telling of this problem or this story, right? These reports have been really effective because they've oftentimes opened the door for discussion on major legislative change. So we'll publish one of these reports, sometimes there's a press conference, and then we schedule a meeting with legislators to ensure that they understand what is going on and why. So I think our most recent major report was about the poor treatment of children in Customs and Border Protection custody, which I think was our second or third report on this issue alone. It's been happening for a really long time. And particularly the treatment of Indigenous children at the border in Customs and Border Protection custody. And so the goal is really to elevate the voices of our clients and try to get these horrors to stop and for conditions to improve by educating the public and educating legislators. Oftentimes that's tied to media campaigns and administrative and legislative advocacy. So administrative advocacy is when we go straight to either an administration, right? So a presidential administration, gubernatorial administration, or the governmental agency in charge with interpreting the law and executing policies, right? So in terms of poor treatment in border protection custody, the advocacy has involved conversations with White House officials regarding what we're learning from kids that we see detained down here, but they all came through that border, right? And then further the administrative advocacy with high-level meetings with Customs and Border Protection. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And under the Trump administration, we had no access to any of that. So all prior working group meetings with the White House, which we had with multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat, all of that was shut down under the Trump administration. There were no longer any communications between advocates on the ground and governmental agencies. No ICE working group meetings, no high-level immigration meetings, none of that happened. There was no dialogue at all. And that's why we had to just rely on media and public pressure campaigns. And then legislative advocacy, if it's something that we can't fix through administrative advocacy or public pressure campaigns, and it's something that's rooted either in an existing horrible statute or something that can be clarified and repaired through a change in law, then that's when we move to legislative advocacy. Legislative advocacy also involves, for example, if there are legislative proposals. Right now there's a bunch of legislative proposals that address immigration, right? What we try to do is ensure that our legislators are educated on the actual consequences of changes in these statutes, right? Be it a new statute or trying to undo a really horrible one or amendments to different statutes, ensure that we're centering our clients' voices and similarly affected communities in these legislatures' decisions, okay? And I'll give some more specific examples about that later. And again, it's always about listening to our clients, listening to the people that we serve, and ensuring that their experiences and their voices are at the center of all of these efforts. Next slide. So we've also engaged in a lot of local advocacy. and I'll go through this quickly. So see, these are some of the issues that we've worked on locally. And very importantly, and I should have mentioned this earlier, none of our efforts are possible without partnerships, really important partnerships. So with grassroots activist organizations, with labor unions, with business leaders, with a whole host of different kind of stakeholders and individuals who may have a different perspective, may have a closer tie to the particular issue. All of these things were accomplished with partnership with a lot of local groups. Stopping detainers, so ICE detainers in Miami-Dade County Jail was a huge fight. One of the partners in that fight was actually FIU, who did a comprehensive assessment of the cost of using our Miami-Dade County Jail to hold undocumented immigrants for ICE. And we were really successful in that, but unfortunately it was overturned. The commission walked it back right after Trump was elected, and it's still in effect. But these are some of the issues that we worked on locally to ensure that we're trying to improve the lives of affected communities. Next slide. So we've engaged in significant state advocacy as well. One of the things that we fought long and hard for was for driver's licenses for immigrants who are in different immigration statuses. So the state of Florida will not provide you with a license if you're entirely undocumented. But the vast majority of people who have any kind of application pending are now eligible for driver's licenses. We worked on ensuring that DCF protects immigrant children to the same extent as any American child. We worked on in-state tuition for Dreamers and undocumented students, fought really hard for my former intern and every other Dreamer, undocumented youth, to have a right to be a licensed attorney in the state of Florida, and we won. We were a plaintiff in the lawsuit against the anti-immigrant bill SB 168. We just won that lawsuit, which was super, super exciting. Prior to its passage, we engaged in a lot of legislative advocacy, but were unsuccessful due to the composition of the Florida legislature. But thankfully, this lawsuit was recently won. And right now we're strategizing on how to combat DeSantis's horrific anti-immigrant executive order that's gotten like no press. But we're still strategizing even on basic communication around it, right? We're investigating whether administrative advocacy is going to be helpful. There's some really harmful language in that order about unaccompanied minors in particular, and prohibiting the sheltering in foster care or in a shelter of unaccompanied children in the state of Florida. So one of the things we're looking at is, will administrative advocacy directly with DCF help? Do we have to file a lawsuit? Like, we're at the very initial stages of figuring out what direction our policy advocacy is going to go on that. Next slide. Federal advocacy. Next slide. So I've covered a lot of this. One story that I will tell you is a campaign that I was very involved in. So I've been involved in a lot of these campaigns as deputy director, but one which was before I was deputy director and I was director of the Lucha program was fighting for the survival of the Violence Against Women Act. So the Violence Against Women Act does a whole host of things that affects every survivor of domestic violence in the United States. And every few years, it has to be reauthorized. And so for 2 decades almost, when it's up for reauthorization, we fight to expand the protections for immigrant survivors. There's a whole history behind why immigrant protections are needed for survivors that I'm not going to get into all those details. It's technical immigration law. But essentially, there was no way for a victim of domestic violence to prevent deportation if her abuser refused to petition for her. And so every time it was reauthorized, we would meet with legislators, we would work with national groups to ensure that legislators understood the impact of expansion of protections. And a congresswoman from Central Florida presented a bill to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act by stripping all of the protections for immigrant survivors. And it was gaining tons and tons of traction. So we started meeting with other national immigrant rights leaders, as well as national leaders in the domestic violence community, not related to just immigrant rights. We also started strategizing with local law enforcement because part of these provisions are, or one of these provisions is for people who have been a victim of a crime and they've cooperated with the police. So their child was sexually abused, they reported it to the police and cooperated with the investigation or prosecution, they could earn a pathway to a green card. That protection is really valuable to local law enforcement and was actually created so that immigrant victims would be unafraid to report violent crimes, domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking to law enforcement. So it's through this coalition with immigrant rights organizations and domestic violence organizations and law enforcement that we started to kind of put communications together about how this affected all of these different populations. One of the things that I was asked to do by this coalition was to share my clients' stories. So I drafted an op-ed that was in the national media, and it was essentially how these changes in law would have harmed two families that I represented. That got national attention. Several articles were written in national high-profile newspapers quoting my op-ed, and then I was doing outreach directly to legislators and met with my clients, and my clients wrote affidavits and statements that were submitted and entered into the congressional record. They were debated in the Judiciary Committee meeting, and we were able to stop this really, really harmful reauthorization of VAWA. It took a really long time. It took a lot of coalition building. And of course, centering the stories of our clients and the families that we serve so that legislators can understand the real impact of their legislation, right? Next slide. Next slide. Okay. I think I'm done and we can engage in question and answer.
So I'm going to go around with microphone. I think Sherry is as well. Thank you so much so far. This is really, really engaging. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we're going to come around with the microphone.
Hello. So I have two questions. The first one is it this hard to attain citizenship in other countries, or is it just the U.S. that is really difficult to immigrate to?
That's a really good question. So I'm not an expert on immigration law outside of the United States. Okay. There are definitely countries where it's just as difficult, or if not more difficult. Those countries don't claim to be a nation of immigrants, right? There are other countries where it's much easier. There are plenty of countries where if you live there for 3 years, you can get a green card, right? As long as you're not a drug trafficker or some other high-level exclusions, right? So I would say that in comparison, we are more difficult, I think, than a lot of other places. Not to say that we're the most difficult, but we are, I think, the most illogical and the most punishing.
Right. And my other question was, what do you believe would happen if we would, like, quote, open our borders or make it easier for people to get citizenship?
So I think what would happen is what happened for hundreds of years, right, before we started
arbitrarily excluding people, right? I think, most people are not asking for just like anarchy, right? Get rid of systems, and just open our borders and not do security checks or anything like that, right? But what has happened, what has been the consequence of having 11 million undocumented people in the United States, right? I think if we look at it that way and we think about everything that 11 million people have contributed to our society, and providing them with a pathway to citizenship is something that study after study after study shows will only improve our economy and our quality of life. So I think that ultimately that's what would happen.
I agree. Thank you so much.
You said that there was some programs that have been shut down because of the Trump administration. I was just asking, have they been brought back up or no? Like, because you didn't mention it, so I didn't know if they were.
Yeah, so some have.
Some have, okay.
But not all. Okay. So the article that was related to my presentation that I never really talked about our efforts on behalf of Dreamers. The DACA program, for example, was shut down and canceled by the Trump administration, and it's still in litigation, right? So first Biden expanded it, and then the court said no. And so now you could, because of a court decision, the Trump cancellation is not in full effect, but people who are newly eligible for DACA can't apply. So if you already have it and you were kind of grandfathered into the program, you could renew it, but new people can't apply. So there are some things that the president could do immediately. And that's one of the complexities of immigration law that I meant to address. But the way that the statutes control certain portions of immigration law, the regulations, which are administrative, those are agencies making those decisions and publishing them, like ICE itself, right? Or the US Immigration and Citizenship Service, Citizenship and Immigration Service, and then you have the president. And so the president's powers on immigration have been kind of up in, it's kind of controversial and people disagree on their power, but it's super powerful, right? So they can decide who we should deport, who we shouldn't deport. And that's really where the Dreamers come in and where DACA comes in, because that's just a decision to not deport Dreamers, right?
And then,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask for you to repeat in general a short summary. You don't have to go into detail, but the DeSantis, I haven't heard of it. Yeah. So when you brought it up,
okay. So there is an executive order signed by DeSantis that is super anti-immigrant. There are a lot of theories as to why he's doing this now. One of the theories is that because he lost the SB 168 lawsuit, he's responding in this manner. The more, I think, the theory that I have attached myself to is that he's more and more trying to identify himself with governors like Abbott in Texas, and with Donald Trump. And it's just political posturing, right? For his like future, I want to be president one day move. And the executive order does a whole host of things, right? One of the things it says is that they want the Department of Homeland Security, they want the federal government to provide them with the identifying information of every single quote unquote illegal immigrant that is transported from the border to Florida. And they define illegal immigrants as people who are unauthorized or people who are paroled. And for anyone that understands immigration law, parole is an immigration status. They're not undocumented. You have parole. You have permission to live and work in the United States. And anyway, he classifies everyone who's undocumented and everyone who's paroled as quote unquote illegal. And it requires that DHS provide them with all that information. Then it requires, and this is like a super superficial summary. It does a whole host of things. It's my disclaimer. It prohibits state agencies from expending any money on illegal immigrants, including parolees, or to ask them to study the impact of how much money and report how much money they're spending on undocumented immigrants, on illegal immigrants. That's his language. It also asks DCF to look into exactly how many unaccompanied minors they are serving. It asks them for information on every unaccompanied minor that's detained in the state of Florida. So how the detention of kids in the state of Florida works is that the vast majority of them are like in large group homes that have to be licensed by DCF. And they're actually really nice places. Homestead was different because Homestead was on federal land, so it was not subject to DCF licensure, right? It didn't meet the standards for taking care of kids. But it's asking DCF to look at every facility that is licensed to house unaccompanied children in the state of Florida and to prohibit DCF from renewing any of those licenses, right? So right now we have a facility who has been waiting for licensure on an expansion of beds because we need more beds for more kids that are coming in, and they haven't gotten it. Okay. It also prohibits, it can be interpreted to prohibit DCF from providing any care to an undocumented child. So we recently had, unrelated to this executive order, just related to some racist CPS investigator in Central Florida, we had a kid who was abandoned at a gas station. DCF is supposed to provide that child with services to the same extent that they would an American kid. Instead, they turn him over to ICE. Right? Not supposed to do that. It's illegal. This executive order essentially calls for the evaluation of DCF's protections for immigrant kids and how much money they spend, and basically tells them they can't do it. Maybe. It also requires local law enforcement and local governments to use their best efforts to comply with immigration, report people to immigration, and all this like typical anti-immigrant racist stuff.
Okay, so I'm just relaying some of the questions that we're getting from online. I'm going to summarize like 2 or 3 of these together. You spoke a lot about the legislative and legal processes that your office does, but at the very beginning, you also kind of mentioned advocacy and support. So the question was, is AIJ exclusively a legal program? So kind of, I mean, I don't mean to make a comparison, but like an ACLU-ish kind of things, but focused for immigrants? Or do you also promote like nonprofit outside of it, supporting people in the process of deportation and any other kind of advocacy outside of the legal system?
It's a good question. So we are more similar to the ACLU in that we are lawyers and we provide direct representation. And then our advocacy is, because we're lawyers, it's really identifying how we can use our skills to amplify our voices as attorneys in the legislative process, in federal lawsuits, with media, et cetera. And so I'm not sure if I entirely understand the question, but in terms of advocacy and support, we engage in terms of administrative advocacy. So I'm not sure if that's what the person's talking about, but for example, if we have a client who's being unlawfully denied access to social services by an agency in Miami-Dade County, we will engage in advocacy to ensure that that client and every other client in their situation has access to that service. So that's not directly related to their immigration process, right? But it is in terms of access to services and other types of administrative advocacy. But we don't provide direct social services. So we have a whole host of community partners that we work very closely with, that we ensure that, you know, for example, if the client needs housing or food assistance or something like that, that we have them successfully referred to the appropriate community partner. Not sure of that answer.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think the answer is that you act like as a bridge, right, between those seeking services and your community partners that you've already developed really close relationships with. So yeah. Another question is, are we already feeling the effects of, or what is your, I'm not gonna say stance, but impression of the immigrant questions that came up in the 2020 census. So is that something, especially in our community in South Florida,
Yeah.
something that you're already seeing, or is it not really presenting itself in its effects yet?
Yeah, I mean, we an earlier census projection from the census 10 years ago already showed the increase of immigrants and people of color as a percentage of our population, and projected what the new census would be and what our trajectory is going to be moving forward. And from my perspective, unofficial, not agency perspective, I think the Trump movement and the anti-immigrant and racist movement is very much informed and was informed by the predictions that were made 10 years ago regarding the level of whiteness in our country.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe now. Oh, there we go. Hi.
Hi.
So all the advocacy that you're doing is absolutely wonderful, and having that sort of law background allows you to do that. But I'm wondering, what can people like us sort of do? Like, I'm a geneticist. I don't know anything about laws. I can't advocate. I can't be an advocate for someone in this way. So what could I do?
I think that's a really good question. When I get that question, I really encourage individuals to get involved in grassroots organizations. So there are a lot of grassroots organizations fighting for the rights of immigrants. And these grassroots organizations often need bodies, right? They need someone to make a phone call to a legislator. They'll provide you with the script. They need someone to knock on doors, someone to show up to an action. And I really think that the grassroots organizations is one of the best ways for people who don't consider themselves experts on the subject to really get engaged and involved. I think one of the other things that we can all do across the board is vote and educate ourselves to vote at every single level, right? So conditions for immigrants in Miami-Dade County are really, really different than they are, for example, in Pinellas County, Florida, St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is a super beautiful, progressive place. I used to live there. I love it. The county sheriff is a monster. Okay. He helped write SB 168. Elected official. We need to educate ourselves from the lowest, like city commission, county commission. One day we will vote for a sheriff in Miami-Dade County in a couple of years, I think. Really inform ourselves as to what positions local leaders, state leaders, and federal legislators have. Understand their perspectives and what it means for them to serve an immigrant community, right? That's a super, super powerful way to affect change. And if you want to get more engaged, I really encourage you to reach out to grassroots organizations who could use everybody's help.
So I think I speak on behalf of everybody here, thanking Michelle. If we can give her a round of applause, please. So much for taking the time of your day to come and talk about this amazing work. And I echo my colleague here. Thank you for being you and doing the work that you do, because that's so necessary right now. Thank you all for your patience with us today. This has been super entertaining, apart from the fact that the talk was engaging. We hope to see you again. I love when the room is this full, because that means we're doing our job and we're getting good conversations going, which is why we're here. So thank you so much, everyone. Please make sure you grab your lunch on the way out. And if you want to talk more about Global Learning Medallion or other global learning initiatives for students, please come talk to us when we're done. Thank you. Thank you.